The Spanish Civil War is a conflict that is very interesting for a variety of historical reasons, and yet it hasn't received a lot of attention from war game designers. So it is kind of surprising, but it's a nice surprise, that in the last couple of months not one but two games came out about this subject. One is Popular Front by Numbskull Games, and the other one is The Spanish Civil War by GMT. Today we're going to talk about this game, and in another video review I'll talk about Popular Front. This is the map, it's printed on paper, it's pretty nice looking, it represents Spain of course, and it shows you that the terrain is pretty interesting. You have a lot of mountains here, and then around you have a net of rivers here, and other minor rivers here, you only see the major ones, and rivers and mountains and other terrain really make things interesting and hard for the attacker because they give a huge bonus to the defender, so there will be a lot of maneuvering positioning you have to do in order to be able to create a powerful attack. At the core, this is a fairly traditional axe and counter game. Believe it or not, there are no cards. Yes, there's still designers that are designing war games without cards. A turn, well, there are several things, but at the core, mainly what you do is at the beginning you will draw a cheat from one of these two pools. There's one for the nationalist, one for the Republican player, and those cheats might or may not create events for that turn. It adds a little bit of unpredictability and historical flavor. After that, you have a segment of strategic movement where players will be able to use naval movement from one friendly port to another friendly port, according to certain restrictions, and or they'll be able to use railroad movement, which is along this railroad system that you see here. Again, there are rules and restrictions. The main one is that it has to be in friendly territory, but when you follow all those restrictions, then you will be able to move strategically units for quite a long distance. Also, you will be able to move more units in later phases of the war, so it gives you pretty nicely the sense of the escalation of the war. After strategical movement, you have the operational movement. You just move your units according to their movement factor. Then you have combat, and again, there are a couple other things here and there, but pretty much this is the main turn. There are several ways in which victory is determined, but the main one is definitely the Republican morale, which you will track on this section of the board here, and it will go up and down according to what happens in the war. In fact, on the map you have several cities that have a red number with a minus symbol. Those are cities that are important to the Republican player. If the nationalist takes control of those cities, then the Republican morale goes down by that number. Luckily enough, if then later the Republicans take control of the city again, that the morale goes up again. Also, there are other cities that have a green number and a plus sign, and those are cities that are important to the nationalists. So if the Republican player takes control of those, same thing, then the morale goes up. If he loses them, then the morale goes down. And there are cities like these all over the place. So it is very interesting because players have a lot of options of where they can go to look for ways of influence the morale, and they really have a lot of ways they can go about it. So there are a lot of different approaches and strategies that can be developed. Also, the game has different scenarios. There is a scenario for every year of the war between 1936 and 1938. There is a campaign game, which is my favorite one, that covers the war from 1936 to 39. And then you also have a what-if scenario set in 1941. Each of these games has its victory conditions. Sometimes it will be about who has the control of a certain area, but really the majority is the national morale. It's above a certain number, the Republican wins. It's below a certain number, the nationalist wins. The game takes supplies into account, and of course, if your units are not in supply, they suffer all sorts of penalties. The way you check if your units are in supply is that you need to be able to trace a line of no more than 3 axes from a unit, suppose we're checking for this one, to a secondary source of supplies. And there are different ones. For example, a friendly town or city can act as a secondary source. In this case, 1, 2, 3, there is a connection between the unit and the secondary source. Suppose that that town is not friendly at all, then another secondary source can be one of your mobile headquarters. So it's pretty interesting. Actually, you can move some of your sources of supply. In this case, 1, 2, and 3, there would be a connection. And it's interesting because the line between the unit and the secondary source can even go through enemy axis. Suppose these are all enemy axis, that still the unit has an ability of going through behind enemy lines quite a bit. Then you need to be able to trace a line between your secondary source and one of your ultimate sources of supply, and there are several ones around the map. There are different ones for the nationalist and the Republican players, and this line here actually has to be all in friendly territory. Combat is handled taking into account the ratio between the attacking strength of the attacker and the defense power of the defender. Then, once you have that ratio, you look at the possible modifiers that are based on different factors: naval gunfire, the position of the attacker, terrain, and there can be modifiers for the die roll, and then more serious modifiers on the shift of the column. Then, of course, once you have that, when you look at the modified column, then you roll a die and you cross-reference the modified number, and the result that you see here, very simple, is the number of steps lost by the attacker and the number of steps lost by the defender. There's nothing but just steps that are lost, which is, a pure bloodbath. Is these modifiers, there are enough that it creates interesting situations and options and things that you have to deal with, but not so many that it becomes burdensome to have to go through all of them each attack just to make sure you haven't forgotten any. To give an example of how the game looks like when it's set up, I'm showing you the setup of the 1936 scenario, which of course is also the beginning of the campaign game. As you can see, there are already several fronts that are fighting against each other. Many things are going on. In the north, you have the republics of the north, which are surrounded by the nationalists. Here in the middle, you have a front of nationalists trying to push through towards Madrid, but luckily enough the mountains here are giving the Republicans good defense. Here's pretty interesting too. Again, there is quite a struggle going on there, but the Republicans will receive interesting reinforcements here and probably will force the nationalists to move back, but the nationalists also had the advantage if they manage to defend in Saragossa or behind rivers. Here the situation is very different because there isn't there are many places where you can hide or get good defense thanks to terrain, and here there is, from this area here, there are some very powerful units that are coming to help the nationalists. They are very powerful, probably the most powerful in the game, at least in this stage. And it's gonna be very hard for the nationalist player for the Republican player, to try to even slow them down. The 1936 scenario and the early phases of the war are not just an introductory part of the game, because even though they don't have some of the things that you have later, such as headquarters and armored divisions, they have, on the other hand, several things that do not apply later, so they just play differently, they just have a different flavor. For example, the Republican will have to rely on units with strong political affiliations. As you can see from those letters there, some units will be formed by anarchists, some by heterodox communists, some by orthodox communists, and these people do not like each other too much. There are special rules and restrictions because several of these groups will not work together with the other ones. So if you want to put them together for an attack, then you have to maneuver them in such a way that the people that like each other will attack together. And there are other rules and restrictions just because these guys are really not well trained and disciplined. For example, when you declare an attack, it's not even sure that they will attack. There might be insubordination. You have to roll on a table. Even if they attack, they cannot execute some special maneuvers like concentric attacks, which are particularly powerful and the nationalist player can execute from the beginning. So it just plays differently. Another element that you have early in the game and you don't have later is the Alcazar, which is a group of nationalists sieged by the Republicans in Toledo, and the Republican player will have to try to capture them as soon as possible, because if the nationalist player manages to rescue them, then the Republican morale will be damaged by that. But also in the early phases of the game, the nationalist player has restrictions, which is ammo shortage. All the units that are north of this line here, the 24 line here, will have a penalty when they're attacking, not when they're defending. And that penalty is lifted for the rest of the game when they can trace a line of supply all the way down to the south of the map. So something that the Republican player might consider is to try to delay that as soon as possible and to have them short of ammo for as long as possible. This is not an introductory war game, not because the rules are complex, because they are not, and I found the rulebook crystal clear. It is just that the execution of the strategy takes some work. There are many units on the board, and they play differently, different strengths, different political affiliations, a lot of factors you have to take into account to play the game effectively. You have to take into account the reinforcements that will enter the game in the next turn and possibly even the following one. The terrain is challenging because it makes it hard to create a powerful attack. You have to do a lot of maneuvering and gathering your units around. There are just many things that you have to do. But of course, all these things that might scare the neophyte away are what makes the wargamer absolutely excited. You're like, wow, there are many units with which I can create different strategies, different attacks, and of course I have to be careful against the combination of units that my enemy can create. The terrain, I can try to exploit that, but I have to be careful about this and that. It's of course what makes the game fun if you love war games. I like the fact that the scenarios play very differently from one another, from the early stages of the war to the late one. It's almost different games based on the same system on the same map, but the real treat definitely is if you play the entire campaign. Then it's really fascinating to see the conflict evolve from this initial struggle between bunches of communists and anarchists that they can't even agree on the basics of what they want to do, and on the other side you have the nationalists, which are better trained and organized but don't even have enough ammo to do what they want to do. And then later you see this escalation to a large conflict with larger armies that move faster on the board using railroads that are supported by devastating airstrikes that use artillery from headquarters. That it's really a fascinating sense of progression you have. So I think it's really a must if you have an interest in the topic, but also if you just like engaging traditional hex and counter type of games, then this is an excellent one. It works very well as a solitaire, so it's hard to pinpoint something that doesn't really work. I think it is an excellent game, and if you're wondering if hex and counter games will ever die, well, this game gives you hope, and it shows you that probably they never will, as long as we have games such as this one.